Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk. My name is Mustafa. What we're going to be talking about today is designing for speed for design for friction. So I'm a UX designer on Chrome, and I've been looking into hacking user perception and speed for quite some time. If you have any questions, please do add them to the comments, and I'm just going to get started. The talk is roughly about 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes at most, and then I'll leave some time for Q&A at the end as well. So when we're talking about speed and friction, first it's really clear to actually see what the definitions of these are, just so that we're not confused by these two topics. So when we're talking about speed, I'm talking about technically fast experiences and how you can actually make sites technically fast, from minified code to loading CSS up front to small images. So when I speak about speed, I'm talking about the technical speed. When I'm talking about friction, what I'm getting at is how we can deliberately slow down the user to make the experiences seem faster. Now, this may seem contradictory, but don't worry, this will make perfect sense. Now, the talk is going to be broken down into a few parts. I'm going to tell some stories, then I'm going to talk about speed, the technical things you can do, then we'll talk about navigation and hacking user perception, and finally I'm going to go on to friction. So just again, salam everyone, and hopefully you will enjoy this talk. So the first part of the talk we're going to get into is a story about occupied and unoccupied time. And this talk is very detailed. So if there's, and you probably won't remember all of it, and that's fine. But if there's anything you do remember, it's the story of Houston Airport. Now, Houston Airport had a high level number of complaints. And the complaints were when passengers would arrive at Houston Airport, they would wait forever for their luggage to come through the carousel and through the terminal building. And they complained quite a lot about this. So Houston Airport come up with a solution. They said, let's spend millions in optimizing everything. So they improved the process, they hired more people, they employed new tech, and they actually got waiting times down to 7 minutes. But despite all this optimization and focusing on the technical speed, people still complained. So like the running joke is, you can see this guy in the background. That's the face of every UX designer when the customer is still complaining. So they started thinking, what could they actually do to challenge this? And so they started thinking about reframing the problem. You see, you can get the bags technically faster, but there comes a point where it's not feasible for like the user experience. Like you could throw the bags, you could do all these things, but beyond 7 minutes, you can't get the bags there faster. So you say, what is the real problem? Well, it's like waiting for the bags is really annoying. So they thought, okay, how can we make the wait feel shorter? And what they discovered is when the planes would land in Houston Airport, the planes would land really close to the terminal building. So they thought, okay, if we park the planes further away from the terminal building, what would happen? And that's what they did. They parked the planes further away from the terminal and complaints dropped to zero. What this showed is if you fill a person's time with an activity, it will make the experience feel faster. So by deliberately slowing down people, the experience feels faster. So if we were to look at this this diagram, it's like 7 minutes of time. We have unoccupied time of the person walking very quickly versus 5 minutes of waiting, and then we compare that with like 5 minutes of walking and 2 minutes of waiting. The whole experience is 7 minutes long. So even though, but the occupied time actually felt, yeah, they were cheated. I can see. Even though it feels faster, it isn't. And the whole purpose of this talk is about this concept. So I'm going to give some examples from a conceptual concept, how we can apply this in UI and user experience design. The next story is a story of legacy systems, and it's known as the slow elevator story. So a common pain point is elevators are too slow. People complain they're waiting forever in a building with 3 elevators. So the typical solution is make the elevator faster. So building managers can install new lifts, they can upgrade the motors, they can create new algorithms. But this is often not really feasible for like buildings, because if you remove an elevator, you've got an even bigger problem. And for building managers, it's important to solve this problem because unhappy tenants means tenants leave. So the outcome is legacy systems can't be replaced and they're very expensive. So what can you do? Yes, you can add mirrors to elevators. I'll get to that. So if we look at the problem, it's like we want to reframe the problem. What is the elevator? So if we look at the pain point, the elevator is too slow. So if we change that to the waiting is annoying, how can we change the waiting is annoying? So what building managers will often do is they'll make the wait feel shorter by putting up mirrors, by playing music and installing a hand sanitizer. And these small distraction techniques allows the system to load and for the elevator to arrive, and then magically everything feels faster. So the first step for a lot of web and app teams is how can we do the small things to distract the user from actually getting there, because it's not feasible to just rip out old code and then add new technology or new things as they come. So this is like the first step from like hacking user perception. It's also the small things you can do. The final story before we get into like applied stuff and research is passing on the complexity to the user. And this is a story of search. Now, this being Google is quite fitting. So way back when, finding stuff on the web was really hard. This was a very big problem, and many people tried to find a solution. So you can see all these images in the background. That's what search looked like way back when. So the solution was add lots of choice and lots of options, because we couldn't figure out as an industry how to do search. We just added input fields, added categorized links, added widgets. Quite often, when we come up with a very complicated UX problem, we throw UI at it, and that's usually a bad thing, because the more UI you have on screen, the more complicated the interface becomes, and the less navigatable and less engaging it actually becomes. So when we look at like reframing the problem again, we look at the pain point. Finding stuff on the web is hard, but it's like finding the wrong content is annoying. So what do? Well, if you look at our founders, they were PhD students, and in science and academia, the way you determine good science versus bad science, typically speaking, is citations. So the more citations you have, the better a paper. Again, typically speaking, the less. So they apply this logic of citations to the web, and what you get is links. So the more in the initial like page ranking algorithm was like the more links something had, the more high ranked it was, and the less low ranked. So once you have like a better classification for system, then you can just simplify the UI. So if you take how search used to be, which was like a sea of links, versus to how it is today, where it's like one input field and 2 buttons, and that was like really radical for its time. But once you solve a complex problem, you can simplify the UI, and then you actually solve the complexity. So instead of saying, I don't know how to solve this, we throw UI and let the user figure it out, you're solving the complexity to make the experience much more seamless. Now, if we look at all of these examples, we have here slow, low friction, slow, high friction, fast, high friction, fast, low friction. Now, this is where you don't want to actually be, like here in this experience here. But all of the experiences pretty much started here. Then moving on from that, the first step is like you have a lot of friction and the system is slow. So how can you increase the friction? So what are the things that you can actually do, like installing the hand sanitizers, the mirrors? Moving on from that, this is where most people end up, like the fast, high friction. So you're as fast as it's possible to be without damaging the experience. Like, so some experiences have a lot of media, and it's not feasible just to remove the media. So there comes a point where you can't really go beyond. But this is like where you want to be, like fast, technically fast and perceptively fast. It's very difficult to reach this point. It depends on the kind of products that you're creating. But again, this is like the golden place where we want to be. We want to be really fast and no friction. But fast is not necessarily from a technical point of view. If you think about the user experience of search, it's simple to use. You see everything immediately. And so the perceptive speed there is really important as well. But speed is broken up into 2 pieces, like the real and the perceived. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some research about speed, and then I'm going to go through all of the other subjects. The first thing I want to look at is the Financial Times. Now, the Financial Times is a finance newspaper in the UK. What's interesting about them is they have a subscription service, so it's like a paywall, and it's quite an expensive one. And their resources are limited, so they can't target every user. So what the Financial Times did is they came up with this clever little algorithm called the tipping point. What they discovered was that if a user visits the website and reads 5 articles a month, the likelihood of them subscribing increased. If they could push that user to at least 9 articles a month, then they more likely will actually subscribe. So they tried to make the site technically fast, and they targeted at those users who were visiting 5 times a month, and then try to encourage them more and then get them to subscribe. But what they found by just making their site 1 second faster, they can increase engagement for everyone. So even though they weren't targeting every single user and users who are like maybe coming 3 or 4 times a month, by just making the site technically fast, it improved engagement. So that's really important. We want to make sure that we make our experiences technically fast. And likewise, the opposite is also true. So when you ask users how important is speed, like 51% stated that they would not make a purchase if a mobile site is loading slowly. So it's really important that it's technically fast. And likewise, for every 2 seconds the site takes a load, but bounce rates will go up by 50%. And this compounds. Conversions falls by 12% for every extra second it takes for a page to load. So being technically fast is really important. Like, we can't underestimate it. But like, user behavior is affected by many different things. So we've spoken about occupied time, as you can see here. And we're going to go through all of these 3, like intention, state of mind, state of body. And I'm going to show some research. The other thing that I want to point out is importance, like why people behave a certain way on the web or in technology is how important it is to them. So sometimes when you're doing like a study on speed, you deliberately slow down your experiences to see what's the cutoff point where people will just abandon the experience. Sometimes in these studies, you'll see like after 20 seconds, 30 seconds, people are still using the experience. That often is tied to importance. So for example, if you're in a foreign country and you can't find where you're going, you're going to wait for the map to load. You don't really have a choice. If you're looking for the address of a hospital, you're going to wait. If you're using like a government website, you're going to wait. You don't have a choice. This is like the importance factor, and this will affect user behavior. You don't really want to believe this because users want to forget bad experiences, and given the opportunity, they will leave your experience and your service. But it's important to point out that all these things affect user behavior. Now, you may be able to find more. These, based on my experience, these 5 are typically like what the buckets are. So intention, like website visits are triggered by many different things. Like 30% of users are just browsing, right? They have no intent when they're on the web. They're just, just looking. Maybe they're at the bus stop. Maybe they're in the doctor's waiting office. This goes up slightly more for retail sites. And again, this makes logical sense because people maybe just window shopping. They're just not really, they don't have any goal in mind. 30% of users actually want to find something out. And this goes up to the 49% for travel sites, which is, again, makes sense. Like, you may not want to make the purchase then, but you want to see how cheap the flights are to like a said destination. You want to find out a specific thing, but you may not actually want to do anything at that point. Only 29% actually want to do something very specific. And again, this goes up to 57% for financial sites, which again makes sense. Like, a financial site isn't something you just visit for fun. You do that for a very specific goal in mind to actually do something then and there, maybe get insurance, maybe get a mortgage, maybe get a credit card or something like that. Like, it's a very driven thing. But the question I always have is, based on the way the importance of speed, is it possible to get someone to jump from one bucket to the other bucket based on improving the speed and based on like what the Financial Times themselves found out? I mean, it's something to think about. So state of body and state of mind. What we find is that when most people on the mobile web are actually visiting and experience it from home. Well, when I first saw this, I thought this was very strange because mobile implies mobile, right? But if you think about it contextually, most people have Wi-Fi at home. The connection is solid. Most people, if they're working, they won't have the freedom or flexibility to visit or see whatever they want. Not everybody's in an office. Some people on a building site, some people in a garage, some people in all a manner of different jobs. But typically most people are at home. And when people are sat down and calm, they're more likely to actually perform a task. So like, of this, people at home, like 74% are relaxed and calm, and they're more likely to do something. But what's interesting, that only 7% are traveling on the move. Now, is that to do with speed? And how much of that affects people's like engagement is something to think about. Now, when we look at like the UX hierarchy of importance, when you ask users what's the most important thing, they almost always say speed and how long it takes for a page to load. And when you go down the other things, it's like how easy it takes how easy it for me to find what I'm looking for, how well the site fits on my screen, how simple the site's to use. These 3 are all about perception. It's like, am I able to see the thing that I want to see am I able to complete the task or the action? Like if you're on an e-commerce site and a person can't find the buy button, then they're going to abandon the experience. From their point of view, it's a hard site to navigate. But if it's easy, then it works. Now, I'm a designer, so how attractive the site looks was at the bottom. It is important to note though, like branding is very important, but when a user's got a specific task in mind, how quickly they're able to navigate through it is the most important thing. So I usually at the beginning of this talk, I promise that there's one thing that you can do that will improve all of your web experiences. And this is the one thing. So the web is made up. Well, so first, as a general rule, if you want your site to feel really fast and performant, you want to make sure that your experience is loaded within 200 milliseconds. After 1 second, the experience feels smooth and it's fine. Once you get to 5 milliseconds, if it's part of a flow, maybe someone's made a credit card payment and the flow you're waiting for it to load is slightly acceptable. By the point of 8 seconds waiting in between actions to happen, you will lose the person's attention. So you want to make sure as a guide that is technically fast. So this is like a sort of rule that you can actually use. On the web, we have, for those of you who work specifically on the web, browsers will typically block any interactions because they want the site to actually load. What happens is, though, perceptively, if someone's trying to tap a button and it's not engaging right away, they may think the site's broken or something's not wrong. So there's like a delay in tap. By adding like this meta tag, you can actually remove that delay. So the moment a user button is seen, they can tap and continue on with the experience. So again, these are like small technical things that you can actually do. So optimizing images. Now, images are like the heaviest thing on the page, and like 52% of like content is images. So as they're the heaviest thing on the page, this is one thing that you can actually do to optimize. Now I'm going to do a demo. This is a progressive web app that me and my team made a couple of years ago that we still update, called Squoosh. What it does is we can actually loading images into the browser, we can optimize them and can make a comparison with the image and the original one. So I'm just going to do like a quick demo. So I'm just going to jump out the screen. 1 second. Oops. So this is Squoosh. So what we do, so normally you can drag and drop an image in here. It's also like it's mobile friendly, so you can upload it from your mobile device. I'm just going to take some of the example images. So we're just going to load this. So this is the original image, and this is like the one which has a codec applied to it. So here we have like the compressors. This is the original, and this is like a Moz JPEG. And already this original image was 2.79 megabytes. Just by leaving the default codec of Moz JPEG, we've managed to reduce the image down to by 69%. So, you know, and if we were to zoom in and say, you can make a comparison between these two images, not much to really note, but you've made a huge saving. So a simple thing that you can start doing today is optimizing your images. Now, say if you're a designer and you work with a marketing team, you may want to share this with them. If you're working with a product team, you may want to share this with them as well, because oftentimes engineers will do the site and then move on to something else. But just by making this as part of your process or your build process of optimizing images can make a huge saving for your teams. So that's Squoosh, Squoosh.app. I'll jump back into the presentation. So please do check that out. At Chrome Dev Summit 2018, we actually demoed this app, and we used the Google I/O's homepage image, and we actually reduced it by 83%. So even us and our teams, this is something that we need to focus on, and it's something so easy that everyone can do, and the tool's very easy to use. So if you don't have something in your build process, please, as a designer or marketing, share this tool and get your teams to start optimizing images, and they can do it themselves. Yes, that's Jake. Also, this is open source. You can also see the code. It's like pinch to zoom. There's like elements, things like that. It's a progressive web app. So if there's things that you see in the app that you'd like to apply to your own experiences, by all means, please do take them as well. Now, that's technical speed. So speed matters on mobile web, but the perception of speed is just as important. Because remember the story of occupied and unoccupied time. Now, this is a very scary statistic. Of sites which are considered technically fast, a third of users still perceive them to be slow. So you've optimized your images, you've done all the technical things, but there's still a group of users who think, why is this loading slowly? What's going on? So this is where we have to start employing perceptive techniques. So the first thing we can start doing is navigation. Now, this is a very weird philosophical question, but have you ever asked yourself what makes a button? So the first thing is buttons need to be inviting. Like, you need to know that you have to be clicked on. So if you look at, say, like a kettle when you want to make yourself tea, there's no text on there. When you look at an elevator, nothing says you must press this button to do blah. We have in the physical world things which are inviting, maybe lights, maybe sounds, maybe shapes, that makes us know that automatically we know we need to click on something or tap on something. So any navigation item needs to be inviting. Now, this is like a bad example of how not, like this is a vending machine for cheese. I don't know why, but for some strange reason, some people want a vending machine for cheese. Now, that's one thing. Now, the technology employed in a vending machine like this is really important. But one thing that's quite notable is that they actually have to write with a sticker and sellotape on there that says this needs to be moved in one direction. Now, this is an example of ergonomics that hasn't been designed in a machine. You think about the technology to actually make sure the cheese doesn't go off, that everything is that they actually have to sellotape something on. That's a bad example. You always need to make your user experience and affordances very, very obvious. Otherwise, you're going to have to stick things on top of labels, on top of buttons like this. So when we look at, say, affordances and buttons, typically speaking, buttons that look like this are not clicked on, and users don't really recognize them as buttons. Whenever you're doing navigation items, you want to make them obvious. Now, when you're using Sketch, Figma, Photoshop, or whatever, this looks nice and elegant, and this looks ugly in that sense. But from a usability point of view, this makes much more sense. The user knows exactly what they need to do because it's physically shouting, I am a button. And this, like research from UX Movement, demonstrated like how these buttons were much more effective. What else? Buttons need to be clear and their functions need to be clear. So a while back last year, like I found this on Twitter, and the Japanese user was using Excel, and they had an important question about the Excel save icon. And the question was, why is the Excel save icon a vending machine? Now, this user has never seen a floppy disk before. They're looking at the shape. And so when you look at the shape, it looks to them like a vending machine. So they were confused as why is Excel doing this? This is the problems of using icons only without the labels. Metaphors change with time and shapes change with time. Like if you look at, say, cameras today, like a lot of picture taking applications will use the take picture as a camera icon. But most people's metaphor for taking photographs is no longer a camera, it's using their phone. So there will be a certain generation who are not familiar with these icons or these metaphors. So you have to be very careful. Whenever we use icons, we have to always use a label. Now, the way people's visual muscle memory work is you read the text the first time and then you'll see the icon. So the icon you'll process much quickly. But the first time you see an experience, you may not understand what the icon really relates to. And another example of this is when I was working on these slides, I was in my study and I had like this icon up, and my daughter saw this icon and she asked this question. She said, "Are you a detective?" It hadn't occurred to me that in the UK, we are taught that search is all about being like an inspector and Sherlock Holmes. Like it's just everywhere, like culturally. So when she sees the magnifying glass icon, she thinks, oh, this is to do with detective or Sherlock Holmes. Likewise, when this icon was shown in rural India by Amazon, the Indian users were asking, why is the search icon a ping pong paddle? Because they didn't have the cultural metaphors of Sherlock Holmes, they were looking at the shape and saying, this looks like ping pong. And they couldn't make the reference to search. So again, whenever you're using iconography, you have to always be careful about the cultures that your site is in and making sure that it's clear. Always make your user experience and UI as obvious as possible. There's no value in hiding things. Another example of hidden UX, like this is iOS. So on iOS, if you're trying to select a piece of text, it can be very frustrating. But this isn't actually how you're supposed to select text. On iOS, you're supposed to hold down the space bar, then the whole UI becomes a trackpad, and then you can actually move the cursor really easily. But most people don't know this. Now, when I give this talk live, at that point, everyone takes out their iPhones to give it a try. So if you have an iPhone, please try this out. But this is the thing. If you hide your experience from the user, they won't see it. Likewise, on Android, when you actually want to jump between tabs, if you simply swipe the URL bar, as you can see here, you can actually jump from the different tabs. And if you hold down this button down here, as you'll see in a second, it will give you your entire histories. So you'll see it trigger now. But these experienced people are not necessarily familiar with. So if you hide, if this is a critical part of your experience, users won't see it and people will miss out on it. Like, there's no value in hiding things. If you're an e-commerce site or a search site or anything that it requires an immediate action, don't hide your experience. Make things as obvious as possible. Make your user experience and UI as recognizable as possible. Now, this was a funny example. So I was on an airplane journey, and the whole flight, I saw the same behavior happen again and again. So this is like the bathroom sign. It's red, so it means the bathroom's occupied. When this will turn green, someone would walk up down the aisle and open this door. Now, the problem is when they opened the door, what they found was a cupboard. And at that moment, everyone would be confused. And throughout the whole flight, the hostess and host had to keep saying, no, the bathroom's over here. Now, if you're on a plane and you open a door and something unusual happens, at that point, you're not going to open any more doors. That's a very scary thing. What is happening is the icon and the shape is as things which are close to each other in proximity, people will make the assumption that there is a relationship. Because this is like the Gestalt principles. Proximity implies relationship. Because this icon is next to this door, people will assume that there's a relationship, that this is where the bathroom is, as opposed to the bathroom being over here. Like a simple thing. And throughout the whole flight, the same mistake was made. So whenever you're doing any UI, make sure that things which are related to one another are next to one another. And make sure that, because people will imply these relationships. Another thing that you find happens in some organizations is they'll try to represent their UI. They'll try to represent their org structure in their UI. So this was like a story when I was working in a company, and they had a carousel on the homepage. Now, the marketing department assumed it was a marketing company. Engineering was said it was an engineering company. Design company, research, whatever. And they all argued about who should have the home image on the home site. Then they decided that, okay, let's have a carousel. And that way, every org in the company can actually have their position on the home page. Once the engineer implemented this, one of the departments complained that their image was not first. So the poor engineer had to design a randomizer, and every lead of every department would check this, make sure that their team actually got seen an equal amount. Now, this is really bad. Showing your org structure in the UI does not help the user. If a user's coming here, they're coming for a specific activity. They don't care who reports to who. They want to know how to do the specific task. So always avoid showing your org structure in the UI. Another thing that you need to think about is giving visual feedback. Because visual feedback reassures the user that when they've done an action, something has actually happened. So the life of a button, a user will see a button, they'll press a button, they'll wait and get enraged by the button, and then they'll press it again because maybe it didn't work the first time. Now, on the web, if you do this with some systems, it triggers the whole experience from the beginning. So the problem with this is we're not reassuring the user that the action's been taken, accepted, and it's been processing. So like in material design, we have a thing called the ripple. Now, this is like our approach to user reassurance. So then when you tap a button, you have this visual effect. Now, the key thing here is you're reassuring the user that something's happened. We've accepted your command. We're processing your thing. Don't worry, you're being reassured. So having some kind of reassurance is important. On desktop, you have hover commands, but you don't really have that on touch screens. So having some kind of responsive feedback is really critical. You want to make sure, because the key thing here is like you want to make sure that the navigation is recognizable, because out of sight is out of mind. If you hide your key tasks and key actions, people won't see them. So, for example, this was like Facebook way back when they experimented with bottom navigation. And what they found was there was a perceptive speed. So when someone went to the hamburger menu and then they went to find their news feed, it felt longer. when they saw the newsfeed button right in front of them, they tapped on it and it loaded much more quicker. Like that perceptive speed of seeing what the person is looking for is really critical. Likewise, when Spotify simplified their menu and they removed items, they saw engagement go up, because the less you focus on the screen, the more of the things which are on screen are engaged with. And this again makes logical sense. So like in Google, we have a pattern called the fab, which is like, the concept of a fab is like, make one choice. What's the one action you want someone to perform on this screen? And then you see engagement go up. So when Trello experimented with the fab as like adding new boards, they saw engagement go up, which makes sense. If you remove all of the UI so that people focus on the one main call to action, this makes much more better experiences on mobile. And we see that focused experiences are far better. So the final part of the talk is we're going to look at friction. So an interesting bit of research showed that all these loading bars are loading the same amount of time, but this one here, users perceive this to be loading 11% faster than the others. This is to do with like the number of ripples which are actually animating. Now, this style is quite old, but it's very interesting that people, even though all these loading bars are the same, people actually think that this is faster. What we find is when you're actually doing any kind of animation or motion, if you stagger the animation, so you start off slow and then you build up speed, the experience feels faster. So whenever you're employing animation motion, that's kind of the feel that you want. So you see here, a user taps, there's a slight delay, and then suddenly the animation explodes. Also, what we like to call like distraction techniques, like the hand sanitizer and the mirror and music of the elevator is employing these kind of animation techniques. Like these small delightful things can actually distract the user and collectively contribute to like the perceptive speed. Now on the web, you have to be careful where you pick your animation motion. You don't want to make the experience slower as a result, but there are places. So if someone's waiting for their credit card payments to process, then they can actually do something. If when they're doing navigation, layout, then that's when you can actually employ it. But animation is really key to user perception. And like we do this at Google. So like when your YouTube is loading a video, you have this progress bar that appears across the top. Now we pause it towards the end to give this feeling of anticipation. That's actually fake. It's a deliberate thing that we do. It hangs because it gives this anticipation of loading and actually works. This is really bad, but it actually works. I do not recommend this at all, but I will talk about it. One thing that was explored was blaming the system. So like with Facebook, when users saw this kind of loading screen, they blamed the app because this was like a custom loading screen. But when they employed this loading screen like this, people blamed the operating system. So they assumed that in this case, it was iOS that was the issue, not the system. So it's like people's perceptiveness, when they see an animation, they'll make associations. I would not advocate doing this because I think it's really bad. Yeah, I feel betrayed as well. But it's still like something that's worth thinking about, how people actually perceive things. Now, when we look at loading screens, now I've did a lot of research on loading screens in previous roles. So one thing, so when I was designing a documentation site, so developers.google.com, we wanted to try out these experiments of like loading screens to see how much of an effect it will have on users. So we came up with 5 different designs. The first one was like loading a low-res image first, and then replacing it with a high-quality one. We tried a spinner design. We tried skeleton screens, having no transition whatsoever, so everything loads in blank. And then finally, we had like a loading bar. And we made a comparison between these. Now, what we found that a majority of users found that there was a difference between the designs. So when you're running a study like this, what you do is you show one video of the screen loading first, then you show the other, and you only show them both once. Then you ask them a bunch of questions, comparing the two, and then finally you ask them on an individual level, which one was fast and which one was slow. Some people believe that there is no difference, but we found that 90% of users said that they saw there was a visible difference between these loading screens. And then over half preferred having some sort of content placeholder. So whether it's a skeleton screen or low-res image, they actually found that this was really important. So I would always say, never show a blank screen. Always show something as quickly as possible. Now, at the end of the study, after the users have made a comparison between the two loading screens, you ask them to vote if they thought on an individual level if this experience was fast or slow. And what was noted that no users in the study found that skeleton screens were considered slow. All of the others at some point were considered slow, with the exception of skeleton screens. It was always considered a fast experience. So that's something to think about. So if we were to sort of summarize that, this is the worst thing you can do, is show a blank screen, right? Because the user has no idea when the content is coming or how long it's going to take. Moving on from that is a spinner. Now, a spinner is better than a blank screen, but the user still hasn't got an idea of how long this thing is going to take. And because of user perception, the spinner may feel like something is broken. Moving on from that, skeleton screens are a good thing to do. However, users do note that gray screens feel broken, like the system is broken. So perhaps you may want to consider using color or detecting, say, like the color of an image and showing that as well, just again to reassure to the user that the system is not broken. The ideal thing to do is a mixture of these techniques. So the moment you have some content, you load it. You may want to do a low-res image that's frosted and then replace it with the high-res image. But more importantly, we find that by using metadata to give a user an indication of the type of content is coming, so like posted date, loading content, actually, again, reassures the user that something is coming along and actually helps them quite a lot. But again, context is important. So on YouTube, if the experience goes really slow, they'll prioritize the video. Now, from a technical point of view, you might load the smallest things first. So the images, the thumbnails. But from a UX point of view, the video is the most important thing on the page. So you pause everything else. Now, users, you have to understand your user behavior and adapt accordingly, because only you know the context of your systems and your experiences. So like in every design talk, you have like an example of this. So this is your perfect design, and these are your users. So what I'm getting across here is I'm giving you lots of different things you can try, but only you know your users and only you know your experiences. You have to test these things with your users to see if each one of these patterns actually fits their experience. So an example of this is Google Photos. So the way Google Photos works is initially a bunch of images will already be loaded. Then we start preloading images further on. And because the first thing people do when they open up Google Photos is start scrolling, you want to preload some images at low res. So if someone was to suddenly scroll very quickly, they're still seeing something rather than seeing nothing. But we have two different techniques for how we load images. Now, initially, when a browser detects a low-res image, it will partially blur it, like you can see. This is like the default behavior, but this doesn't feel that very nice. So what the Google Photos team wanted to do is blur all the images by default because it felt much better. But the problem is when you apply this CSS blur to all of your images, everything slows down because a person could have 100 images, and that's really bad. So what they did was they told the browser to default it to the pixelated state. So it's fine. The image will only be seen for a small amount of time and is better than showing nothing. But when users actually tap on an image to expand it, what they'll do is they'll blur out the pixelated image and then replace it for the full quality one once it's ready. So two different techniques for getting a very similar effect. So again, the point here is only you understand your users and understand the context of your users. So you have to use these different techniques to fit your own experiences. Because the key thing here is you want to make sure that the system looks like it's progressing and is slowly loading, but showing like that something is coming, as opposed to processing where the user doesn't know what's coming. Now, this is just like a visual example of how you can do that. But the idea is you want to make sure that a user understands that progress is making, and therefore they're reassured to the experience that it is actually happening. And one final one is Trivago experimented with like when the state goes offline. So if you're searching for hotels on the Trivago site and you lose internet connectivity, what they do is they pull up this fun little game. And they found that by doing this, 67% of users still came back to the system. So just doing this very fun thing, which is a hard thing to pitch to a boss, they showed that it was actually really effective and worked. So you want to think of creative ways to do this. It's not just about showing skeleton screens or having like status. Think of the creative things that you can do to make sure that you engage with your users, to again reassure them that your system is working. So to summarize the whole talk, you want to make sure you reframe the problem and think about user perception. You want to keep navigation clear and simple. You want to avoid blank screens and show content as soon as possible. And finally, you want to make sure you park the plane further away from the terminal. So if you want to learn more about these things, we have this book is a bit old. It's a PDF on technical things you can do on the web and some of the research which I covered in more detail. It's our speed ebook. Also, if you're interested in progressive web apps, I have this web book and also a PDF on progressive web apps that you can check out, which goes into some of the technical things. This was done in collaboration with Microsoft. And finally, I have a UX course on Skillshare that you can take, which it's an hour-long course which goes through all of the steps of user experience and all the things that you can actually do, like from paper prototyping to research and all the techniques that we use at Google and in design sprints. So with that, I'll say thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed this talk. If you have any questions, please do feel free to ask them. Thank you. I can see some questions. Is anyone any questions on specifics? If nobody has questions, I can start singing if you like. I don't mind. I don't want to panic the organizers. I will give it a couple of minutes. Please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll start singing. Okay. Image optimization, how to integrate in development workflow. Okay, so there is a system called Image Opt-in, where there's an app that you can use that allows you to compress it, similar like the way we do with Squoosh. But there is also npm things that you can actually implement in your code base, so it does it automatically every time you build your system. So there are things that you can actually use. So Image Opt-in is worth checking out. As image, and again, that's a small thing that you can do. We were thinking about including some kind of build process in Squoosh. It's worth checking out the code repo to make sure that if there's any updates. I haven't worked on it in a while, but I know Jake Archibald and Surma, the two engineers, have been working on stuff quite regularly still. So it's worth starring that GitHub repo. I'll just go back into my slides so you can actually see it again. So if you check out the repo, you can actually star it and then see how if you can do that. Otherwise, Image Optim is the tool that I would recommend. And there's loads on, depending on what build system you're using. Can I give some tips for App UI? Is there anything specific you had on App UI that you, in terms of tips? Apart from, the easiest one, I suppose, is make your UI as obvious as possible. You don't want to hide things from your users. You want to make sure that everything is obvious and clear. Now, sometimes, some languages, this is very difficult. So when you compare English to German, German words and Dutch words are about 30% longer. So this is why sometimes people will not use icons and they just use the labels themselves. I think at that point you need to ask yourself, how many call to actions do I really need on screen? So you want to make sure that you simplify the call to actions. So maybe you just make a choice. So if you're an e-commerce site, make the buy now button the most prominent thing on the screen and hide everything else. If you're on, I'm trying to think what other systems is a good example. If you're a news site, do you need to see all of the navigation? If someone's reading an article, you could probably hide things. You just want to focus on what is the core activity, a task you want someone to take, and focus the UI purely on that, and hide everything else. Do you recommend including part of the CSS inline for essential stuff to improve loading time? I'm not an engineer, but for some of the engineering folk on the Chrome developers DevRel team, they actually have recommended doing some inline CSS. Some, when they load things, will do it in the head of the document. I know there's like CSS in JavaScript as a technique. The two people to worth following on Twitter is Unicravitz and Jake Archibald and Surma. They've been looking, and obviously Adi Osmani as well, and a few others. But there's different techniques. It's worth trying out or doing a demo to see how things how things load quickly. But you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. Again, it's all about your system, like I was saying with the Google Photos. So yeah, again, I know back in the day we used to have like these hard, fast rules. The important thing is how your users use your system and vice versa. So if it works for you, then it's good. I wouldn't try to employ a generic rule that you hear to your systems if it doesn't work for your system. And I'll give an example. There was a partner based in Turkey who was doing a news website, and in their news website they used carousels. Now, typically speaking, we say carousels are bad because user engagement. And so I gave the usual spiel of saying, don't do a carousel. But when the partner said to me was, actually, we found it really popular with the users because Turkish users in that context use carousels to quickly skim through the news stories of the day. So when they removed it, they got negative feedback. So again, a UI pattern that maybe, or a coding pattern, which may be seen as not good, may actually be very good for like your region where you're working and your users. So I would do it on a case-by-case basis. Have the general, like it's like Picasso said, learn the rules so that you know how to break them. So again, like knowing these techniques, but then break them for your systems to help your users. We've got like, I think 2 more minutes because there's going to be another follow-on session. So if you still have questions, please do go ahead and ask. Or I could just go back to singing again. If no one has any other questions, then we can end the call in a couple of minutes. More tips for app UI. So what do you do when you feel like you can always improve which delayed deployment do you feel fully satisfied? So I mean, we always experiment like with our teams of like what things actually work. Me personally, I find the skeleton screens and the pixelated images work. Ideally, you wouldn't need to do them, but there are times when you have to because network connectivity can die for any number of reasons. So like I live in London, and London is a metropolitan city. Internet connectivity can die very quickly. Just because you're going through buildings are old, tall, you have what you call dead zones. So having these techniques can actually help for many different contexts. But it's worth testing these things as much as possible. to see how like they improve your user experience. So then when you get good positive feedback, so in the studies that we did where we're comparing two different loading screens, the ones which had a positive effect, we tried to implement, was technically feasible. But we always test and always make sure that we keep up with the users, because sometimes things change, or like metaphors can change as well. If users start feeling that a certain experience is slow, then it's time to adapt and change. But I would always say test with the users and try to come up with really interesting ways of testing. So one thing you might want to try and do, if you get, say, 10 users, you put them on a bus and you say to them, you've got 3 stops. By the end of this bus journey, you have to buy something from an e-commerce site. And if you can successfully buy it, then it's yours. And then deliberately slow down the experience just to see how frustrating something is, and just to see how quickly someone can find things. Because you're basically trying to create a stressful point in order to test the people, to see how quickly they can actually respond to something. And then you learn just from observation. And afterwards, you can ask people, how did it feel? What did you like? What did you dislike? If you had a magic wand and can make things improve, what would you do? And again, it's like this allows you to observe the experience. Sometimes when we test speed, we only do it in the browser, which is not great, because you want to try and test things outside as well, like to make a comparison with the real world. Yeah, you can deploy and change along the way, or have like an A/B test, or like a testing environment. Like there's lots of prototyping tools that you can use, like Principle, Xure, XD. There's loads of ones that and so you may not even have to do code. You just use these visual prototypes to deliberately test things. But yeah, you can deploy with the real systems to actually deliberately slow stuff down. It's worth doing it with real code, or making like a version that only a certain subset of users can actually see. But as the organizer said, if you want to check me out on Twitter, you can feel free to do so. If you have more questions later on, maybe the French called it the spirit of the stairwell. It's like all the things you wish you'd asked after the event. Feel free to ask me any questions, or if you're curious about anything like that. We're going to be ending the session now, because we will be moving on to the next topics and the next session. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for your questions. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something from it. Again, please do check out our links, as you can see in the comment section, and also check out our YouTube channel, as you can see there. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and have a great rest of the conference.